You will sit down, or I will have the bailiff remove you from this proceeding permanently." District Attorney Sterling Cross's voice boomed through the packed Baltimore County Courthouse, rattling the overhead lights and freezing every person in the gallery mid-breath. The woman standing at the witness stand didn't move. She didn't blink. She tilted her chin upward, letting the harsh fluorescent glare catch the quiet, burning defiance in her dark brown eyes. Her voice came out low, steady, and cold enough to crack glass. "You've been removing people permanently for 20 years, Mr. Cross. The only difference today is that someone finally came back." Sterling Cross's jaw locked. The heavy gold pen in his right hand slipped from his fingers and clattered against the prosecution table. In that single, suspended heartbeat, the most powerful man in Baltimore's criminal justice system looked exactly like what he was, a cornered animal who had just heard the trap snap shut. The William Donald Schaefer Courthouse sat at the intersection of Calvert and Fayette, a hulking gray monument of limestone and blind ambition that had loomed over downtown Baltimore for nearly a century. Its marble hallways smelled of floor wax and dread. Its courtrooms had witnessed everything from petty theft arraignments to capital murder trials that made the national news. But, to Sterling Cross, the building was a personal trophy case. Every polished corridor, every oak-paneled chamber, every trembling public defender who avoided his gaze in the elevator, all of it belonged to him. At 57, Sterling carried himself like a man who had never once been told no. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a squared jaw and steel-grey hair cropped military short. His suits were custom-cut from a tailor in Georgetown, always charcoal or navy, always immaculate. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine every morning by a man he paid in cash and never learned the name of. He wore a Mont Blanc watch that cost more than most of his junior prosecutors made in a month, and he had a habit of checking it conspicuously whenever a defense attorney was speaking, as if their words were physically wasting his precious time. Sterling had served as Baltimore County's district attorney for 14 years, winning 4 consecutive elections by margins that would have embarrassed a dictator. The local press called him the Hammer, a nickname he secretly adored and publicly pretended to find distasteful. He had built his career on a simple, brutally effective philosophy: convictions at any cost. His office boasted a 94% conviction rate, the highest in the state of Maryland. Politicians lined up to shake his hand at fundraisers. Police unions endorsed him before he even announced his campaigns. Judges deferred to him. Defense attorneys feared him. And the people who had been ground to dust beneath the wheels of his ambition simply disappeared from public memory, which was exactly how Sterling preferred it. But the conviction rate was a lie. Not all of it. Sterling was smart enough to build his empire on a foundation of mostly legitimate casework. But buried deep beneath the polished statistics, hidden inside sealed files and expunged records, was a pattern of corruption so methodical it would have brought the entire Maryland Attorney General's office crashing down if anyone had bothered to look. Exposed evidence, buried exculpatory witness statements, coerced testimony from jailhouse informants who were promised early release for saying whatever Sterling needed them to say. And at the rotten center of it all, a 20-year relationship with Hargrove Development Group, a real estate firm that had quietly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into Sterling's personal accounts through a web of ghost consulting contracts and offshore LLCs in exchange for one very specific service: making problems disappear. Whenever Hargrove wanted to acquire a city block, and the residents wouldn't sell, fires had a curious habit of breaking out, and whenever fires broke out, Sterling's office had a curious habit of finding a convenient suspect within 72 hours. On this particular Thursday morning in late October, courtroom 4B was standing room only. The air was thick and stale, carrying that particular courthouse smell of old paper, body heat, and industrial cleaning solution that never quite masked the underlying scent of human anxiety. The case on the docket was State v. Hargrove Development Group, a sprawling civil fraud and arson conspiracy trial that had been building for 3 years and had already burned through 2 judges, 4 defense motions to dismiss, and approximately $900,000 in legal fees. Sterling wasn't technically prosecuting the case. He had recused himself 6 months earlier, when the first whispers of his connection to Hargrove surfaced in a Baltimore Sun investigation. But everyone in the courthouse knew the recusal was theater. His hand-picked deputy, a nervous, sweating man named Assistant D.A. Franklin Loomis, was running the prosecution exactly the way Sterling had scripted it, slowly, incompetently, deliberately losing. The plan was simple. Let the case collapse under its own weight. Hargrove walks. The evidence gets sealed, and Sterling continues his uninterrupted march toward the governor's mansion. Sterling sat in the second row of the gallery, technically a spectator, but positioned with the unmistakable authority of a king, watching his generals execute his battle plan. He had, his legs crossed, his Mont Blanc pen tapping rhythmically against his leather portfolio, and a faint, satisfied smirk resting on his lips. Everything was proceeding exactly as designed. The defense had just finished a devastating cross-examination of the state's fire investigator, shredding the man's methodology until the jury looked bored and confused. Loomis had barely objected. 2 more days of this controlled demolition, and the case would be dead. Then the heavy courtroom doors opened, and everything changed. The sound was unremarkable, the soft groan of old hinges, the whisper of air pressure shifting. But something about the rhythm of the footsteps that followed made Sterling's head turn. They were unhurried, deliberate, the measured cadence of someone who had walked a very long road to reach this exact moment and was not about to rush the final steps. Naomi Saunders moved down the center aisle like she owned every square inch of the room. She was 32 years old, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and dark skin that caught the overhead light like polished mahogany. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight, low bun that left her face completely exposed, open, readable, and absolutely unafraid. She wore a fitted navy suit, no jewelry except a thin gold chain tucked beneath her collar, and she carried a single manila folder in her left hand. No briefcase, no laptop bag, no entourage of paralegals wheeling document carts behind her. Just a woman and a folder walking toward the well of the court with the terrifying certainty of a surgeon approaching an operating table. Loomis stood up, looking confused. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls its next witness. Naomi Saunders, Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, Senior Forensic Fire Analyst." The defense table erupted. Mitchell Greer, Hargrove's lead attorney. A ruddy-faced man in a $3,000 suit who billed at $1,200 an hour. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not on the original discovery list. We received supplemental disclosure less than 48 hours ago. This is a clear violation of." Mem Saunders was added pursuant to a federal cooperation agreement filed under seal, Loomis interrupted, reading stiffly from a sheet of paper, as if reciting words he didn't fully understand. The court granted expedited approval Tuesday. But Sterling wasn't listening to the legal ping-pong. His eyes were locked on the woman taking her place at the witness stand. He watched her raise her right hand for the oath, and as she turned to face the courtroom, their eyes met. The blood left Sterling's face so fast it was visible from the back row. His complexion went from its usual ruddy bronze to the color of wet concrete. The Mont Blanc pen slipped from his fingers for the second time and rolled beneath the pew in front of him. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't move. His body had turned to stone, while his mind detonated. He knew that face. He had seen it once, 20 years ago, pressed against a rain-streaked car window in a courthouse parking garage. A 12-year-old girl, skinny and shaking, watching her father being led away in handcuffs through a curtain of cold November rain. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't pounded the glass. She had simply stared at Sterling with an expression no child should ever wear, a look of absolute corrosive understanding. A look that said, "I see what you are." Her name then was Naomi Saunders. Her name now was Naomi Saunders. She hadn't changed it, hadn't hidden it, hadn't buried it. She had carried it like a loaded weapon for 2 decades, and now she was pointing it directly at his chest. "Please state your qualifications for the record," Loomis said. "I hold a master's degree in fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland, College Park," Naomi said. Her voice was clear, unhurried, and precisely calibrated to reach every corner of the courtroom without ever rising above a conversational tone. "I spent 4 years as a fire investigator with the Baltimore City Fire Department before joining the ATF's National Response Team. I specialize in origin and cause analysis for complex structural fires, with a secondary focus on insurance fraud and arson-for-profit schemes. I have testified as an expert witness in 43 federal cases across 9 states. Every syllable landed on Sterling's chest like a brick. He gripped the wooden pew in front of him, his knuckles whitening. The courtroom seemed to be shrinking, the walls pressing inward, the air thickening to something unbreathable, because 20 years ago, Sterling Cross had destroyed a man named Wendell Saunders, and Wendell Saunders had a daughter. The memory hit Sterling like a freight train, dragging him backward through time with nauseating force. 20 years ago, Sterling wasn't the district attorney. He was a hungry, ruthless assistant prosecutor clawing his way up the ladder with his fingernails and his teeth. The Hargrove people had come to him first, not because he was the best lawyer in Baltimore, but because he was the most ambitious and the least burdened by conscience. They had a problem. A stretch of row houses in the Sandtown, Winchester neighborhood was sitting on land that Hargrove needed for a mixed-use development project worth $200 million. The residents, mostly black, mostly working class, mostly families who had lived there for generations, refused to sell. They had organized, hired a pro bono attorney, and were winning their fight in housing court. So, 2 of the row houses burned down on a Tuesday night in November. The fire department responded in 7 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the buildings were fully involved. No one died, a small miracle, but 14 families lost everything they owned in 45 minutes. Wendell Saunders was one of the firefighters who responded to the call. He was a 20-year veteran of the Baltimore City Fire Department, Engine Company 33, a quiet, meticulous man who coached youth basketball at the Druid Hill Rec Center on Saturdays and kept a vegetable garden in his tiny backyard that his neighbors joked was nicer than the Sileburn Arboretum. He was also the department's most experienced fire investigator, and when he sifted through the rubble of those row houses, he found something that didn't fit the official narrative. The fire hadn't started from faulty wiring, as the preliminary report claimed. The burn patterns, the pour indicators, the accelerant residue, everything pointed to deliberate, professional arson. And when Wendell pulled the property records, he discovered that Hargrove Development had purchased fire insurance on both buildings 3 weeks before the blaze. Despite not yet owning either property, Wendell did what any honest man would do. He brought his findings directly to the prosecutor's office. He sat in Sterling's cramped, cluttered office on a Thursday afternoon, laid out his evidence in neat manila folders arranged chronologically across the desk, and waited for justice to do its job. Sterling had smiled. He had shaken Wendell's hand firmly, looked him in the eye, and promised him that the real arsonists would face the full weight of the law. That night, Sterling drove to a steakhouse in Fells Point and had dinner with 2 executives from Hargrove Development Group. By dessert, they had reached an agreement. By the following Monday, Sterling had manufactured a case against the most convenient target he could find, the very man who had uncovered the truth. The fabricated evidence was elegant in its cruelty. Sterling's investigators planted modified fire department records, showing that Wendell had been the last person in the building before the fire. They produced a forged bank statement showing a $10,000 cash deposit in Wendell's checking account, money that had never existed. They located a jailhouse informant named Deshaun Briggs, a repeat offender facing his 3rd strike, and offered him a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying that Wendell had confessed to setting the fires for insurance money during a conversation in county lockup. The trial lasted 11 days. Sterling personally handled the prosecution, despite being only a mid-level assistant DA at the time, a violation of office protocol that nobody dared to challenge. He was magnificent in his brutality, pacing the courtroom with theatrical fury, painting Wendell Saunders as a greedy, calculating arsonist who had betrayed his oath as a firefighter and endangered the lives of the very community he was sworn to protect. Wendell sat at the defense table in a suit he had borrowed from his brother because his own clothes still smelled like smoke. He answered every question with quiet, desperate honesty. He explained the accelerant patterns. He described the insurance records. He begged the jury to look at the physical evidence. But Sterling had already poisoned the well so thoroughly that nothing Wendell said could take root. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, Wendell Saunders was sentenced to 25 years in the Maryland Correctional Institution in Jessup. 14 months later, Wendell Saunders was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest due to undiagnosed hypertensive heart disease. Unofficially, the guards who found him noted bruising on his neck and chest that was never photographed, never documented, and never investigated. The prison medical examiner signed off on the paperwork in under an hour. The file was closed. Wendell Saunders became a statistic, another Black man who died quietly behind concrete walls, mourned only by the people who had known the truth all along. Sterling remembered the parking garage. He remembered walking to his car after the verdict, loosening his tie, already mentally composing his press statement. He remembered seeing Wendell's wife, Gloria, slumped against the passenger door of their old Honda Civic, sobbing so hard she couldn't stand. And he remembered the child in the back seat, the girl. She had pressed her face to the rain-streaked window and locked eyes with him across 30 feet of oil-stained concrete. No tears, no sound. Just those eyes, burning holes through the glass and through his skin and straight into the black center of his chest, where his conscience should have been. He had looked away. He had gotten into his BMW and driven to Fells Point to celebrate. Now, 20 years later, the girl from the parking garage was sitting 6 feet away from him, and she had brought the fire with her. "Miss Saunders," Loomis continued, glancing at his notes, "your office was asked to re-examine the structural fires associated with Hargrove development properties across Baltimore over the past 2 decades. What were your findings?" "Objection," Greer barked. "Scope. This trial concerns specific properties from 2021 through 2023. Counsel is attempting to bootstrap decades of irrelevant. The Federal Cooperation Agreement authorizes testimony on pattern evidence across the full timeline," Loomis said, sounding surprised by his own confidence. "It was approved by Judge Whitfield." "Overruled," the judge said flatly. "The witness may answer." Sterling felt the room tilt. He should leave. He should stand up, walk out, get in his car, and drive straight to Reagan National Airport. He had $380,000 in a Cayman account that Hargrove didn't know about. He could be in a non-extradition country by morning. But his legs wouldn't cooperate. His body was riveted to the wooden pew as if nailed there, because some buried, self-destructive part of him needed to hear what came next. "My team re-examined 14 structural fires connected to Hargrove-acquired properties between 2004 and 2023, Naomi said, opening her manila folder. Every single one was ruled accidental in the original investigations. Every single one preceded a Hargrove property acquisition by less than 90 days. And in 12 of the 14 cases, the fire investigation was conducted by an outside contractor, Pinnacle Forensics, whose sole client, according to IRS filings, was Hargrove Development Group. The gallery stirred. Reporters shifted in their seats. A sketch artist in the front row stopped drawing and just stared. But what was most significant, Naomi continued, was not the fire patterns themselves. It was the exposed prosecutorial file on the only case that ever went to trial, the 2004 Sandtown Winchester fire. Sterling stopped breathing. "I obtained the complete case file through a federal FOIA request 18 months ago. The original fire investigation report, authored by Baltimore City fire investigator Wendell Saunders, concluded that accelerants were present and that the fire was deliberately set. That report was never entered into evidence at trial. Instead, the prosecution submitted a modified version, with investigator Saunders's own findings removed and replaced with a fabricated conclusion supporting accidental origin. The courtroom noise swelled. Greer was on his feet again, shouting something about hearsay and chain of custody. The judge banged his gavel twice. Sterling heard none of it. His ears were filled with a high-pitched whine, like the sound a television makes the moment before the screen goes black. "Furthermore," Naomi said, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos, "I obtained original bank records from the Maryland State Employees Credit Union, showing that the $10,000 deposit attributed to Wendell Saunders at trial was made from an account belonging to Pinnacle Forensics, the same Hargrove-funded contractor. The deposit was reversed within 72 hours of the conviction and rerouted to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The holding company, Tidewater Capital LLC, lists one beneficial owner." She paused. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that Sterling could hear the ballast humming in the fluorescent tubes 30 feet above his head. "The beneficial owner is the former lead prosecutor on the Saunders case, the current district attorney of Baltimore County." Sterling Cross. The room detonated. Reporters in the back rows surged forward, shouting questions over each other. The sketch artist's charcoal pencil snapped. Gallery spectators gasped, swore, grabbed each other's arms. Greer slammed both palms on the defense table and screamed for a mistrial. Loomis stood perfectly still, his face blank with shock. He clearly hadn't known the full scope of what his own witness was about to unleash. Sterling shot to his feet. This is a lie. His voice cracked on the last word, breaking upward into a register that shocked the people sitting nearest to him. They physically recoiled. This is a coordinated, politically motivated smear campaign by a disgruntled, emotionally compromised federal agent with a personal vendetta against this office. I demand— Sit down, Mr. Cross. The judge's voice was ice. You are a spectator in this courtroom. You will conduct yourself accordingly, or you will be removed. Sterling's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. He looked around the room with the wild, jerking desperation of a man searching for a fire exit in a burning building. Every face he met, jurors, reporters, attorneys, bailiffs, stared back at him with the same expression. They knew. The entire room knew. The mask he had worn for 20 years had been ripped away in 90 seconds, and the thing beneath it was exactly as ugly as everyone had always suspected. I wasn't finished, Naomi said quietly. The room went silent again. Every head turned back to the witness stand. In addition to the financial evidence, my office obtained a sworn affidavit from Deshawn Briggs, the jailhouse informant whose testimony was used to convict Wendell Saunders in 2005. She pulled a single sheet from the folder. Mr. Briggs recanted his testimony in full. He stated under oath that he never spoke to Wendell Saunders, that he was coached by a member of the district attorney's office on what to say, and that he was promised a sentence reduction in exchange for his cooperation. The affidavit was notarized 11 days ago. He also provided a name, Naomi added, her eyes rising from the document, to meet Sterling's across the courtroom. The person who coached him. The person who wrote the script he memorized and recited on the stand. The person who manufactured every piece of evidence used to convict an innocent man and send him to die in a prison cell. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. Every eye in the courtroom was already locked on Sterling Cross, who stood frozen between the pews, his face the color of old chalk, a dark stain of sweat spreading across the back of his charcoal suit jacket. The heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom opened for the third time that morning. This time, no one heard footsteps. They heard the sharp, unmistakable crack of tactical boots on marble. 8 federal agents in dark windbreakers with FBI printed in block yellow letters across their backs, moving in a precise V formation down the center aisle. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. There was nowhere for Sterling Cross to go. The lead agent, a woman with close-cropped grey hair and a face that suggested she had seen every variety of human corruption, and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it, stopped at the end of Sterling's pew. Sterling Avery Cross, she said, loudly enough for the courtroom stenographer to capture every syllable. I'm Special Agent Diane Okonkwo, FBI Public Integrity Unit. You are under arrest pursuant to a federal grand jury indictment for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, evidence fabrication, and complicity in the wrongful death of Wendell James Saunders. Please step into the aisle and place your hands behind your back. You have no authority here. Sterling's voice was a whisper now, stripped of every ounce of the theatrical thunder that had terrorized courtrooms for 2 decades. I am the district attorney of Baltimore County. I have prosecutorial immunity. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Okonkwo said. She wasn't interested in his resume. I suggest you use it. 2 agents stepped forward and took Sterling's arms. He didn't resist. The fight had drained out of him completely, pooling on the courtroom floor like blood from an open wound. They turned him around, pulled his wrists together, and the handcuffs closed with a sound that silenced the last murmur in the gallery. Click, click, a small, metallic, permanent sound, the period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. As they walked him toward the aisle, Sterling turned his head. He found Naomi still seated at the witness stand, her hands folded calmly over the manila folder. She wasn't smiling. There was no triumph on her face, no righteous fire, no cathartic release of 2 decades of rage. There was only stillness, the deep, bone-level quiet of a person who had finished an impossibly long piece of work and could finally set the tools down. Their eyes met one last time. Sterling opened his mouth, to threaten, to plead, to justify, to beg. But nothing came out, because looking at her now, he didn't see the federal agent or the expert witness or the woman who had just ended his life with a manila folder and a steady voice. He saw the 12-year-old girl in the rain, pressing her hand against the car window, and he realized, with a sickening, plummeting clarity that made his vision blur at the edges, that she had been coming for him every single day since that moment. Every class she attended, every exam she passed, Every fire scene she crawled through on her hands and knees. Every late night in a federal archive pulling 20-year-old bank records. All of it had been building toward this exact Thursday morning in courtroom 4B. She hadn't just wanted justice, she had become it. They marched Sterling Cross out of his own courthouse in handcuffs. The hallway was packed. Word had spread through the building like fire. Clerks, attorneys, paralegals, janitors, cops, and civilians lined the marble corridor, 3 deep, watching in absolute silence as the hammer was walked to the elevator in his sweat-stained charcoal suit, his military-sharp hair suddenly looking thin and brittle under the hallway lights, his polished shoes scuffing against the floor because his legs had stopped working properly. Nobody spoke to him, nobody spat, nobody cheered. The silence was worse than any of it would have been. The trial of Sterling Avery Cross lasted 19 days. It dominated the national news cycle for the better part of a year. The Baltimore Sun ran a 12-part investigative series that won a Pulitzer. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all covered the proceedings live, one of the rare stories that briefly united the fractured American media landscape in shared revulsion. 3 sitting judges in Baltimore County resigned before they could be investigated. The Hargrove Development Group was dissolved by court order, its assets seized, its executives indicted on 46 separate counts. Deshaun Briggs, the jailhouse informant, testified for the prosecution and wept openly on the stand as he described the script Sterling had written for him. The lies he had memorized phonetically because he could barely read. Naomi Saunders did not attend the trial. She had done her part. She filed her reports, submitted her evidence, and returned to her work at the ATF field office. She did not give interviews. She did not write a book. She did not appear on podcasts. When a producer from a major streaming platform called her personal cell to discuss a limited series adaptation, she said, "No, thank you," and hung up before the woman could finish her pitch. The jury convicted Sterling Cross on all counts after 6 hours of deliberation. The sentencing judge, a woman Sterling had once publicly mocked at a bar association dinner for being too soft on criminals, looked down at him with an expression that wasn't anger, satisfaction. It was something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a system that had allowed this man to operate unchecked for 20 years because he delivered convictions and nobody wanted to ask how. She sentenced him to 32 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. 7 weeks later, Sterling Cross was processed into the Chesapeake Detention Facility in downtown Baltimore, a holding facility he had sent thousands of defendants to over the course of his career. The intake guards recognized him immediately. They didn't rough him up. They didn't insult him. They simply processed him with the same bored, mechanical efficiency they applied to everyone else, which, for a man who had spent his entire life demanding special treatment, was its own kind of devastation. His cell was 8 by 10. The mattress was 2 inches thick. The window was 18 inches wide and looked out onto a concrete exercise yard surrounded by razor wire. On his first night, lying on that mattress in the dark, Sterling heard the sounds of the facility settling around him. The distant clang of doors, the murmur of voices echoing off concrete, the buzz of fluorescent lights that never fully shut off, and he understood, with a finality that crushed the air from his lungs, that these sounds would be the soundtrack of whatever remained of his life. He was 60 years old by the time sentencing was done. He would be 92 when he was eligible for release. The math wasn't complicated. He would die here. He would die in a building he had used as a weapon for decades, surrounded by men whose lives he had treated as disposable arithmetic in his career statistics. The ledger was balanced. The books were closed. On a cool Saturday morning 3 months after the sentencing, Naomi Saunders drove her car to the Sandtown Winchester neighborhood in West Baltimore. The block where her father had fought the fire 20 years ago was unrecognizable. The burned row houses were long gone, replaced by a community garden and a small pocket park with a painted mural of neighborhood history along the back wall. She parked on the street and sat in her car for a long time, watching an old man water tomato plants through a chain-link fence. She reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small, smoke-darkened brass badge, Baltimore City Fire Department, Engine Company 33. Her father's badge recovered from his personal effects after his death and mailed to her mother in a padded envelope with no letter attached. She had carried it with her for 20 years, through college, through graduate school, through the ATF Academy. through 43 federal cases and 9 states, and 14 re-examined fire scenes and 18 months of FOIA requests and 11-hour days in windowless archive rooms, pulling financial records that hadn't been touched since the year she was born. She pressed her thumb against the raised lettering, feeling the grooves of the numbers and the faint warmth of the metal in the morning sun. She didn't cry. She had done her crying a long time ago, in places and ways that no one else would ever know about. She got out of the car, walked to the edge of the community garden, and stood in the spot where her father's fire truck had parked 20 years ago. The air smelled like fresh soil and October leaves and something green and alive, pushing up through ground that had once been nothing but ash. Naomi Saunders closed her eyes, held her father's badge against her chest, and breathed.